All right, so good evening, everyone, and welcome to this joint program with the City of Waterloo Museum and the International Women's Air and Space Museum, Living and Working in Space. So just some housekeeping tonight. This program is being recorded and will be uploaded to the YouTube channel for the International Women's Air and Space Museum shortly after the program. If you are joining us and you feel the urge to ask a question, please help us out. Jennifer and Marcy, our presenters this evening, and put those in the chat box. I am Sarah Fisher. I'm the director at the International Women's Air and Space Museum, and my job is to monitor all the questions. So we have a lot of content to go through. There's going to be a lot of questions, a lot of great insight that these two women are going to be presenting this evening. So we want to make sure we get through it all. Please make sure that you are muted. So if a phone rings in your home or wherever you're tuning in from, it can sometimes mess with our audio. So stay muted, put your questions in the chat box, and we will have time at the end for Q&A. So without further ado, Jennifer Huber has worked in the museum field of museum programming and interpretation for 15 plus years in Canada. She is our representative from the City of Waterloo Museum. She is particularly interested in social history, education, and the history of community development. Jennifer has experience ranging from seasonal summer staff and frontline historic interpretation to a variety of program coordination roles. Currently, she is the City of Waterloo Museum Program and Engagement Associate, which is a newer role within the city. The goal of this job is to develop programs and engage the community as part of the city's ongoing heritage strategy. So welcome, Jen. Marcy Frumker is with the International Women's Air and Space Museum, and she is a lifelong enthusiast of space, having followed the early NASA space program as a child. When the International Women's Air and Space Museum moved to Cleveland, Ohio in the late 1990s, she found an opportunity to bring together her passion for space with education and outreach. For roughly 15 years, she has been a museum trustee, serving on the board, and is currently our resident space advisor. Her background in journalism has brought new and exciting space news to our communities through her regularly appearing articles in the IWASM member newsletter, our monthly e-blast newsletter, and social media. She's interviewed numerous astronauts, including Katie Coleman, Kate Rubins, and most recently, European Space Agency astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti in October 2021. Many of her interviews can be found on our newly relaunched YouTube channel. She has been an integral part of the IWASM team and is currently working with a group of staff and volunteers to revamp our Mercury 13 exhibit, newly entitled Quest for the Stars, set to open in October of this year, in light of Wally Funk's historic flight in July 2021. The flight that once again, and Marcy and I were super excited when we found out about this, that she was going to launch, where Funk beat American John Glenn's record once again by becoming, at the time, the oldest person in space. Wally Funk now holds the record as the oldest woman in space at age 82. So Marcy's passion knows no bounds, so we are excited to have her here with us this evening. So I will unspotlight myself and turn the mic over to Jen and Marcy.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate the introductions. And just want to say welcome to everybody who's interested in learning more about women in space. It's something that we're really fascinated about here at the International Women's Air and Space Museum. And let me tell you, our mission of the museum is to collect, preserve, and showcase the history and culture of women in all areas of aviation and aerospace. And let's check out our first slide here and who we got on this slide. This is an image from the very last launch of the space shuttle. That was STS-135 in July of 2011. I was privileged to be able to cover that launch in the media center, where you get to meet all sorts of astronauts who are hanging out there. And of course, this being the last shuttle launch, there were a lot of them. So for someone who's into space, it was a dream come true. And over on the far right, you can see the second Canadian woman in space, Julie Payette, and she flew on 2 space shuttle missions, both of them going to the International Space Station. And she was also the first Canadian to participate in an International Space Station assembly mission and the first Canadian to board the ISS. And on the left, far left here, is American astronaut Kay Heyer. And she flew on 2 space shuttle missions. And one was an assembly mission that brought the cupola up to the ISS. And that's a 7-windowed area where astronauts can look down at the Earth. And they all love going into that area. It's also used for robotic operations, like using the Canadarm2 that's up there. And then in the center, right here, is NASA astronaut Katie Coleman. And she flew on 2 space shuttle missions, and she flew on 1 long duration mission as a flight engineer on the ISS.
Awesome. I could listen to Marcy talk for days. You have so much wonderful stuff to share, so thank you.
No problem. I can talk about this subject for many days.
Yes.
And on this image here, we're going to talk about Roberta Bondar. Of course, she was the first Canadian female astronaut in space. And she was also the first neurologist in space. You might not know that. She spent 8 days on Space Shuttle mission STS-42 in 1992. And on her Space Shuttle mission, the Space Lab was in Discovery's cargo bay. And Space Lab was a fully equipped laboratory developed by the European Space Agency, and that was its contribution to the Space Shuttle program.
Yeah, one of the things I loved about Roberta Bondar is actually her badge, and you can see it in the center of your screen there. Being that she was the first neurologist that went into space, she represented that on her personal badge by this rod and septum that you see at the top there. So that was part of her crest. She also put, obviously, the Canadian maple leaf on it, and you'll notice that the maple leaf is morphing and changing shape into the shuttle as it goes. And really, she wanted to do that as that symbolic piece of Canadians joining and supporting the work that's being done by NASA and participating in that global picture there. She also wanted to include the Earth because she wanted to look at the terrestrial, sorry about that, application of the space research that's going on. She also included the Great Lakes. So she's from Sault Ste. Marie, which is in the northern part of Ontario. That's the province that I'm in here in Waterloo. And it kind of sits right above the Great Lakes right there. So you have Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, and Lake Huron, that kind of border between the 2 countries there. And one of the things I thought was really fun is she actually had a science teacher and an artist together work on her own badge there. So Marcy, can you tell us a little bit more about her time in space and her experience?
Sure. Thanks, Jen. And one of the things that I like reading about from different astronauts is hearing their own words about their spaceflight experience. And here's what Roberta Bondar wrote in her book called Touching the Earth. She said, "I promise myself that I will have adventure, love, and fun each day of my life. I will always think of the Earth as never before, cherishing the sense of awe that this flight has inspired within me." Those are great words we can all use, I think. And when she was on this mission, in order to complete as many experiments as possible, the crew worked in 12-hour shifts around the clock. So they were always working. They had a red team and a blue team. And much of the crew time was devoted to experiments, of course. And they were designed to study how their own bodies adapted to living in space. And this is important because astronauts experience a loss of minerals from their bones during exposure to microgravity. And if the calcium loss continues indefinitely during spaceflight, the likelihood that crew members would break these bones would increase the longer a mission lasted. So this was really important thing for them to study on this mission. And studying the effects of microgravity on bone growth, maintenance, and repair are very important for planning long space flights, like going to Mars, for example, because that takes like at least 6 months to get there and 6 months to get back, and not counting the time you're on the planet Mars. And these experiences during the space shuttle time help prepare space agencies and their astronauts for the long duration missions that are now on the International Space Station, usually they're about at least 6 months length in time on the ISS. And even some of the devices that were used in the shuttle area kind of set the tone for the later missions on the ISS. One of those devices is a glove box, a microscience glove box, which is right over here. And this is one not on Roberta's flight, but on another shuttle mission. And they also were using those on the International Space Station later, just a little bit different size. And I'm going to show you a picture of what it looks like on the ISS. And here you can see NASA astronaut Peggy Whitson, and she's got a bigger glove box that she's using on the International Space Station. And again, these are used for science experiments that need a contained area. And Peggy is the first woman to fly 3 long duration missions. And they were all on the International Space Station. And she's also the first woman to command the ISS, first woman to command the ISS a second time. And she even set a record for the number of spacewalking hours by a woman of 60 hours, 21 minutes. That's a long time outside of space. And you can see her here. She's on one of those spacewalks in this picture on the left. One of my favorite pictures. And over the course of her 3 long duration missions, she accumulated 665 days in space. And that's currently the most by any US astronaut, male or female. And again, the groundwork was laid by the space shuttle astronauts in terms of continuing on the research to the ISS astronauts. And one aspect of this was studying the effect of radiation on their bodies. And in space and on the ISS, astronauts are exposed to higher radiation than on Earth because they don't have the atmosphere and the magnetic fields that protect us on Earth. So what can happen from radiation? Well, it can damage the DNA of our cells. It can lead to cancers and cause cardiovascular health problems. And because of the radiation exposure, NASA has set limits for both men and women astronauts, how long they can be in space. And also it has a difference for how old the astronauts are. And so Whitson logged more than 1.8 years of her life in space. So she had to retire as a NASA astronaut in 2018. And she then became a consultant for Axiom Space. So that's a private spaceflight company. And she's actually going to be launching on one of their missions probably at the end of this year, the end of 2022. And she's going to be the commander of that mission on a SpaceX rocket. And so she found a way to go back, even though NASA said she couldn't go back. And you will be able to see Axiom 1 is having their first launch up to the ISS at the end of this month, at the end of March. So look for that. And here's what she said when she was leaving the ISS on what was, she thought, her last mission in 2017. She said, "I will miss the enchantingly peaceful limb of our Earth from this vantage point. Until the end of my days, my eyes will search the horizon to see that curve."
Yeah, I love that. I think that's such a beautiful perspective to have there. The exhibit that I'm hosting here in the City of Waterloo Museum, if you wanted to get a quick peek at it, Marcy and I did a little video that's also up on the YouTube channel, so be sure to check that one out. That looks a little bit at the health and space exhibit that you see parts of just behind me here. And radiation is one of the parts that we actually talk about, is those impacts and the health issues that come from that, and why it's so important for astronauts to have the proper equipment and to make sure that they're taking care of themselves in such a way that the extra radiation isn't causing harm to them, as Marcy had alluded to right there. But there's lots of other problems that can come from that as well. We mentioned some of the cancers, the heart problems, the cataracts in the eyes that can come from it. But being an astronaut, that's not the only risk that you're taking. And inside the exhibit, we look at a few other of the risks that, that can impact an astronaut while they're in space. And I'm going to pass it back to Marcy, because I know you have a really great story about this, the isolation of space and how that has a greater impact. And we look at that here in our health and space exhibit. But can you tell us a little bit more of a personal story, maybe about Jessica Muir?
Thanks, Jen. So another aspect of living on the ISS is the isolation that astronauts experience while they're living on the station for 6 months or more at a time. most of the time is working on science experiments, like the one that Jessica Meir is working on here on the left. And they live in tight quarters. They have indoor workouts and they have family video conferences with their loved ones on Earth about once a week. And of course, this sounds a lot like what folks experienced here on Earth during our COVID pandemic period, which we're still in. And so a lot of similarities in terms of what that's like with what they do up there. Now, she spent 7 months on the ISS, and she ended up returning back to the planet in April of 2020, and that was right at the height of the pandemic. So she explained to media that it was really, really hard to come back to Earth at that time, since she was gone for such a long time, and yet she still couldn't hug her family and friends when she came back because of COVID. So imagine that experience after you've been away from Earth for 7 months. So she had to endure more isolation after experiencing the isolation that she had on the ISS. And normally astronauts spend their first night back on Earth in quarantine, but for Meir, it was an entire week because of the pandemic. They had to be extremely precautious about that. And on the image on the left, let me just go back to that for a second. So I said this was a science experiment. So Jessica Meir here is working to replace a failed component within the space station's combustion integrated rack. And this was in support of a project by one of our actual museum members, Dennis, who works at NASA Glenn in Cleveland. And after 4.5 years on orbit of this activity, testing for this finally ended this past month. So that's pretty amazing. And since you're away from home for such a long time, for 6-7 months at a time, what happens about holidays and birthdays when you're in space? Well, so they, of course, missing celebrating birthdays and holidays with their families in person. But many astronauts have said that they kind of think of their crewmates as their space family. And so they celebrate with them. And so you can see in the center image here, the stockings are out. And that's Canadian astronaut David St. Jacques on the left, and NASA astronaut Anne McLean in the middle, and Russian cosmonaut Oleg Kononenko. And they're wearing their holiday hats, and they also have an elf on the shelf in the background there on the right. And that was used on their Soyuz flight as a zero-G indicator. And that's how the crew knows when they're actually weightless in space when they launch on the rocket. So it takes about 8 minutes or so for that rocket to get into space. And that's how they can determine whether they're actually weightless or not, by their little stuffed animal or toy that they might have. And on the image on the left, that's NASA astronaut Kayla Barron, and she's up on the International Space Station right now. In fact, she just did a spacewalk there the other day, which I watched a little bit of, which is kind of neat. And she's shown with some holiday gifts, which are floating around. So those are in midair, kind of looks like she's juggling, which is easier to do on the ISS. And then in the image on the right, that's the crew of Expedition 42, and that included European Space Agency astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti. And they left their cookies and milk out in the airlock that they used as a kind of a makeshift chimney for Santa that year.
That's so fun. I love it.
I wonder if Santa liked those.
Yeah.
And another thing that's really, really important for astronauts in space is exercise. Exercise. It's important for us on Earth down here, but it's also super important for astronauts who are up on the International Space Station. So one of the ways to fight the effects of microgravity on the bodies is to have a regimen of at least 2 hours of exercise every day on the space station. So there are 3 different ways that they can do that. They have 3 different devices, which are pictured here. So over on the right here is NASA astronaut Sunita Williams, and she's on a treadmill that you can see here. Although it looks a little different than a treadmill on Earth. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then we've got Shannon Walker up on the top here, and she just came back from space about a year ago. And she's working on something called the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, or ARAD, The NASA likes acronyms. And this is kind of like a weightlifting machine, but in weightless gravity. So it's kind of a different take on that. And here's NASA astronaut Karen Nyberg, and she's on a bicycle. But the interesting thing about this bicycle is there's nothing for your hands to hold, and there's no seat for your bottom. So it's just pedaling, because you don't actually have to sit down when you're in weightlessness like that. So it's kind of different, of course. And here's a little bit more in depth about some of that equipment that's used for the treadmill. So they actually worked out a lot of the designs on this here in Cleveland at the NASA Glenn Space Center, which is one of only 10 NASA field centers in the United States. And this is like a harness on a mannequin that they were testing to see, what would work to keep the astronaut physically connected to the treadmill while they're exercising in space. And then this is sort of a setup here. This is again on Earth, but with the treadmill kind of like on a wall, and with a test subject suspended from these different apparatus here to test what it would be like if they were in space. Of course, we don't have zero gravity down here, so that's how they could test it. And of course, another thing you have to worry about when you're in space or on the ground is getting sick. Nobody wants that on Earth or in space, but you kind of have to prepare for that nonetheless. So in this image on the right, NASA astronaut Mark Vandehei, who is actually up on the space station right now, and he'll be coming back on a Russian Soyuz in just a couple weeks. So he's testing, drawing blood on NASA astronaut Jeanette Epps. And they're practicing doing these kind of techniques while they're on the ground before they become astronauts up in space. And sometimes they have a medical doctor with them, but not all the time. So they have to be well-versed in all these different kind of medical techniques. And they also have tests for eyes, because they found that eyesight can be very definitely changed when they're up in space. And as a result of that and the testing that they've done, they found that they need to have different glasses up in space for the astronauts in case they need to wear a different kind of lens because their eyes are changing while they're up in space. So that's another thing they have to account for. So they have different strengths. And this is an image of some of the kinds of medicines that they have up on space station. So it's not like they can just come home and go to the drugstore and pick up some medicine if they need it. They need to have it there. So here's some of the medicine that they would have up on space station. And a recent study up on the ISS found that astronauts' brains actually adapt to living in weightlessness by using previously untapped links between neurons or nerve cells. So understanding how spaceflight affects the human brain is really important to ensure safer long distance missions.
Yeah, that's so true, because it really is about learning from what's happening to the astronauts so that we can make it better and safer for them all. What's really interesting about where I'm coming to you tonight from is in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, is we actually have a researcher who's working on the cardiovascular system. So the way the blood is actually flowing through the body, to the limbs, to the brain, to all those different parts that we have. And Karen was actually on the space station when one of his studies was going on. It was actually his second study. It's Dr. Richard Hewson. And he was looking at how blood flows throughout the body in space. So really what he was trying to determine is what was necessary for astronauts when they came back down to Earth. So a lot of astronauts experience dizziness and faintness because the way their blood flows differently when they're in space. They often get a syndrome called puffy head and chicken legs because their legs get rather slender and the blood starts to pool or gather in their heads more so. So that made them more likely to faint when they came back to Earth and gravity was reintroduced to their blood system, as well as their body as a whole. So Dr. Richard Hewson actually developed a leg cuff that was more accurate at testing the blood pressure that was happening inside the bodies for the astronauts in space, but then they also used it back here on Earth. And through this research, they were actually able to determine which astronauts were more likely to experience signs of dizziness or fainting so that they could take better care of them and make sure that their return was more successful when they came back to gravity. So we can see that some of those experiments are making an improvement in the astronauts and their ability to return. Now, I did want to introduce, we've already kind of met her once on our opening slide, but Julie Payette, she is the second Canadian female to go up to space. And I just wanted to pause for a moment on her little badge you see on the left there. She wanted to celebrate human exploration of space. And she did this through that rocket ship. And you'll notice that there's 4 different pictures on the rocket ship there. The first one is the star, and she wanted the star to represent the knowledge that was gained through our space exploration. Then we have the flower to look about what we've learned about the environment of our planet and what we've learned about the space that's around us and the earth that's under our feet. The crescent moon was to represent the future, where we're going, that excitement and that energy. And the music note, which I thought was really fun. Julie is particularly musically talented. So I think that inspired it a little bit, but the music note is really about the creativity of humankind and that sensibility and that adaptability that has allowed us to go to space and to get so much research accomplished out there. You'll notice that she has a circle in the background, and that's to represent Earth, but it has no boundaries on it. So it really wanted to represent that uniting force, or that uniting front that it requires for all of us to go to space, to work together, and that there really is no boundaries internationally for us to have that level of success. She also has a kitty cat, if you can find that in the picture on the rocket there. That's to represent the ground crew that supported her. So all of her colleagues, the people who are here, her family, and everybody else, that was part of her mission that made it such a great success. And she had a French artist from Quebec create this there for her. So Marcy, can you tell us just a little bit more about Julie's experience in space and maybe what she was up there to accomplish?
Yeah. So on her first mission, which was STS-96, again, Space Shuttle mission, she was the lead robotic arm operator. And also on her second mission, STS-127, which was also a mission to the ISS. And you can see on the right, she's shown with a tortilla. It looks like might be some peanut butter on it as it's floating in the space shuttle. And astronauts use tortillas in space and on the ISS as well, instead of bread, because, we eat bread, sometimes you can get crumbs. And you don't want crumbs in space because they can float around and get inside of equipment, and then you're in some big trouble. So that's why they've been using these tortillas for a long time now up in space. And of course, eating is important in space, just like it is on ground here. I think it's important. So here we have on these images, this is NASA astronaut Sandy Magnus. And on the right, she's showing preparing some food in space. And most of the food on the ISS is made with water that they use to reconstitute the food. Or they also have food that's just ready to eat. And resupply cargo ships periodically bring fresh fruit and vegetables. And so they're always looking forward to those cargo ships, so they get fresh fruit and vegetables. And another thing, they have salt and pepper, but they use liquid salt and pepper. So it comes out of a bottle instead of a shaker like you would do on Earth. It comes out of a bottle and they squeeze it onto their food. And over on the left here, you can see Sandy Magnus, and she is actually doing some cleaning up on space station, just like you gotta sometimes clean on Earth, not fun, but you gotta do it. So she's got a vacuum and she's cleaning up on the space station. And they generally have to do that probably once a week, at least, up on space station to get rid of the dirt. They don't want it in the equipment.
So those house chores follow you even to space is what you're telling me.
Absolutely.
Well, it's funny that, yeah, Sandy was actually in space during Dr. Richard Houston's first experiment that he was running, which again had to do with the heart and in the blood flow that was happening within the body and how it changes over time. I'll read you the name of the study and then I'll give you the short form, because as Marcy mentioned, NASA likes short forms, but it's the cardiovascular and cerebrovascular control on the return from the International Space Station. So the CCISS for short, which I thought was a lot easier to say and a lot nicer of a name for it. But basically they wanted to again check the flow that was happening within the body and see what was necessary for astronauts. So we saw some of the workout equipment or the exercise equipment that astronauts were using up in space, right? We saw the harnesses that hold them onto the treadmills and the bikes. And really the part of this research was to look at if the astronauts needed to do even more exercise to encourage the blood to flow throughout their body and to keep their heart rates up so that when they came back to Earth, their bodies were more equipped to return to a gravity environment. Now, what his findings did discover is that most astronauts did experience lower heart rate when they were up in space, but it did really depend on the individual. So it wasn't something you could say happened among everybody the exact same, but it was determined that extra exercise probably would be beneficial to the astronauts in space. So if they had any free time, they might end up doing some extra working out. But I know that a lot of astronauts did have some fun things that they chose to do in their free time up in space. Is that right, Marcy?
Absolutely. So here's some of the things they would do during their free time. This is NASA astronaut Katie Coleman on the left, and she was very musical. She brought a bunch of flutes that she played up on the International Space Station. They also have harmonicas, a saxophone, a keyboard set, and a guitar on board. And a little story about Katie Coleman. So she was in the US Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, stationed there at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And actually our museum, the International Women's Air and Space Museum, was right near Dayton when it first opened. And so Katie actually volunteered at our museum when it was near Dayton. And she's told the story to me and to other people that she was encouraged to apply to become an astronaut by some of the folks that were at our museum. So that's kind of a neat story that she did. And on the right in the image here, you can see 4 astronauts who were up on the space station at the same time. And 3 of them were actually from a space shuttle mission that was STS-131. And they're in the blue shirts. Up on the top left, that's Dottie Metcalf-Lindenberger. And then to her right is Naoko Yamazaki from the Japanese Space Agency, and Stephanie Wilson also in the blue shirt right below her. And then in the maroon colored shirt, that's Tracy Caldwell Dyson, and she was actually a flight engineer up on the space station at the time. And this is the first, and so far, the only time that we've had 4 women astronauts up in space at the same time.
So far, right?
So
It's
far,
coming.
so far. We'll hope that changes again. These records are all made to be broken. That's what all the astronauts say.
Perfect.
And here's someone who came back last year. This is NASA astronaut Megan MacArthur. And all these slides on here are talking about Canada's huge contribution to the ISS. And that's the Canadarm2. And on the right, Megan is shown at the robotic workstation, and she's operating the robotic arm. And the image on the left shows the robotic arm in action outside of the station, and it's connected to a cargo vessel. And then the patch on the right is from the original Canadarm that was used during the space shuttle program.
Yeah, so this is the Canadarm2, which, as Marcy mentioned, we're pretty proud of up here in Canada. It was made just a short distance from where I am in Waterloo in Brantford. And it was added to the ISS in 2001. And it's really neat because it's kind of got like a tube with 2 hands on either side, and they're called latch end effectors. And basically it works that either end of it can kind of be anchored onto the ISS, and then the other one can act like a hand and do the work that's required for it. So it can actually inch around the ISS if it needs to as well, which I thought was a pretty neat fun fact. It can be controlled from space, as we can see here in the picture. It can also be controlled from NASA, or it can be controlled by the Canadian Space Agency, which is located here in Canada. And they're actually the ones who helped put together this exhibit, Health in Space, that's just behind me here. But one of the things I thought was so cool about the Canadarm2 is it could lift 255 pounds or 116 kilograms. That's like lifting 8 school buses at one time. So it's a pretty strong piece of machinery that was put out there. And while the arm is important, the astronauts in space are doing lots of other things than just using the arm as well. So Marcy, can you tell us some more about some of the experiments that they would be doing up in space?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. So here's the main thing, of course, that astronauts do on the ISS is science. That's their main thing that they do. So on the right is NASA astronaut Kate Rubins, and she's done 2 long duration space missions up on the ISS. And she's shown with the -80 lab that's used to store blood samples of the astronauts for medical testing. So they bring those back to Earth and they do experiments on those back on Earth, find out what happened while they were up in space. And I interviewed Kate Rubins before she launched on her last mission in 2020. And she said that she was really excited to lay her, quote, nerd cards on the table by doing more pipetting of microbial sampling in her free time on the station. So Kate was a virologist before she became an astronaut. So she was very interested in learning more of what was on the space station that they didn't know about. And on the left is NASA astronaut Serena Onion Chancellor, and she's mixing samples there for a protein crystal experiment. And I also wanted to mention, you can see the International Space Station when it's dark outside. And all you have to do is go into a search engine on your computer and type in ISS sightings, and that will take you to the NASA website that's called Spot the Station. And you can find out there, you can put in your email or phone number, and NASA will update you with where your location is and when the ISS will be flying by. And it's really fun to see when I go outside and do it at night. All my neighbors know what I'm doing because they know I'm a space geek. But it'll tell you where it's coming from, so the direction it's coming from, what direction it's flying to, and about how high it's going to be in the sky, and how long you'll be able to see it for, so the duration. And it will be the brightest object that you see in the sky, other than the moon, and it will be the fastest moving object you'll see in the sky. So you'll know it's not an airplane, it's the ISS going by because it goes really fast. So I highly recommend that you go see it. It's a lot of fun. And coming up in the future, so this is going to be the Crew 4 mission. And flying on this mission is Samantha Cristoforetti of the European Space Agency. And she was on her first mission in 2014 to 2015 for 200 days. And ISS crews can be from Russia, European countries, Japan, Canada, and the US. And with international crews, you can have some differences, obviously, in culture and language. And the non-Russian crew members have to learn Russian. And many astronauts have said, well, the language up on the ISS is kind of what they call Runglish. So it's sort of a combination of Russian and English, sort of mixed together. And food is also a combination of different foods from different countries. The main stable of the foods are Russian and American, but different international crews have brought food from their own specific countries. And Cristoforetti explained in her book, The Diary of an Apprentice Astronaut, that remarkably life is simpler in space. Kind of interesting. She said life in space is full of constraints, but also it's linear, it's pure, and it's crystal clear. So much so that you can lose touch with all the ambiguities and the irreconcilable contradictions that are part of our life on Earth. So that's what she wrote. And she's going to be returning as part of the SpaceX Crew 4 mission. And it's set to launch, right now it's set for, I believe, April 15th. And also on the crew is going to be Jessica Watkins. And she's going to be the first African-American woman to live on the space station on a long duration mission. There have been other African-American women who have visited from the space shuttle, but she'll be the first to actually live as a crew person on the ISS. And Jessica and Samantha actually flew on, well, they didn't fly, they were on a mission together but it was under the water. And that's what this image here on the right is. So they were on an underwater mission back in a 12-day analog mission. And that was back in 2000 that she was on that under the sea. And Jessica Watsons is also named to the NASA Artemis program. And that's going to land the first woman and also the first person of color on the moon. So that's pretty exciting. And actually the Artemis first uncrewed vehicle will be launching, they say probably in May timeframe. So look for that coming up. And you may know of Jenny Sidey-Gibbons. So she was selected as a Canadian astronaut in 2017. And she trained alongside the NASA 2017 class of astronauts for 2 years. And she's doing robotics in Canada training on the right. And on the left, she's doing a practice run for a spacewalk. And that's how they learn to practice spacewalks. They do that underwater in what's called the Neutral Buoyancy Lab in Houston, in Texas. And she's already worked as a Capcom or capsule communicator with the ISS. And nobody knows exactly when she's going to be picked for her first mission, whether that'll be to the ISS or maybe she'll get a mission to the moon on the Artemis rocket. So that would be pretty cool in that program. But she will be the third female astronaut from Canada going into space. And on the Artemis missions that'll be going up, there'll be another Canada arm. And I was just reading about this the other day. I was telling Jen. So this is going to be called Canada Arm 3. So that's number 3. And that's Canada's contribution to the Lunar Gateway. That is going to be a smaller space station circling the moon. And they're actually planning on operating that from Earth. And so this will be a new thing coming up, Canada Arm 3. So look for that in the future. And we are ready for questions. So if anybody has questions, you need to put them in the chat. And here's some information about our museum. So this, again, this is for the International Women's Space Museum. Our email address for general questions, our hours, research hours, our website, and you can also visit our events page for our upcoming programs. This is just one of my favorite pictures. This is the space shuttle when it was attached to the ISS. And this was taken by an astronaut from a Soyuz looking back at the station as he was coming back to Earth. And here's my last slide. And just a little more tidbit here. This is the 2 women astronauts who did the first all women's spacewalk. So you've got Jessica Meir, who we talked about on the left, and Christina Cook, who's on the right. And that was back in September of 2019. And also have a QR code here. So you can actually scan the code on your screen and you can learn more about the museum. You can donate, find out about our events. So that's it for me, but whatever questions you have, we're happy to answer. So
Marcy is just a wealth of knowledge. So I tell you, I could talk for hours and I learn something new pretty much every minute. So take your opportunity to get some questions answered.
Yeah, so I'm just going back in time here to look for some questions.
I will say, you know, I feel like everyone was just so engrossed in all the wonderful, amazing information that you were sharing this evening, Jen and Marcy. I will give a special shout out to Dennis, who is one of our members of the museum, works at NASA Glenn Research Center, and he put in a lot of wonderful links in here to supplement what Marcy was talking about in terms of, you know, Axiom 1. So Marcy talked about that, if you recall, when she was talking about Peggy Whitson and Peggy Whitson's future flight. He also added in some more information on how to spot, like the actual spot the station.nasa.gov web address as well. so you can get text alerts. So wherever you are in the world tuning in this evening, thank you, Dennis, for providing those links. One of the questions that we do have is from Benny, who wants to know, how does NASA know that it's safe to go to space?
Good question, Benny. Well, there's risks, and just like in everything in life, there's risks. And so astronauts are prepared for that. They know it's a risk to go up into space. And like we know, there have been accidents where it didn't turn out good and crew have died. And so NASA's experienced that, and Russia's experienced that as well. So it's not risk-free. But I think just like in anything in life, they're willing to accept the risk, and they try to make it as safe as possible. And really, in talking with different astronauts and hearing them talk about their experience about, like, are they afraid about launching on a rocket? I might be a little fearful about that, but, they're really not. And the reason why they're not is they have so much training, they say. So the training really prepares them for different things, what they call contingencies that can happen in space. And so they feel that they're prepared well enough for any kind of emergency or contingency that can come up. And so that's why they feel like they know what they're doing. They're trained for their mission. And so their main concern is, not screwing anything up. That's what they're more concerned about, I think, that they complete their mission successfully. I've heard them talk, and that's really, really important to them. They know that.
Yeah, and every time we go up and a new crew goes up and they do another set of experiments, we learn something a little bit more. So we can make it a little safer and a little bit better as we go forward. But yeah, great question.
Exactly. And even when they go on spacewalks or EVAs, so there's a lot of things that they have to prepare for in advance. And they practice this not only in the neutral buoyancy lab, but they also practice it on computers. They do VR training, virtual reality training for it. So they go through what's going to happen, and they're trained for, like I said, things that don't go right. So they have to know what to do if something happens, and they go out in teams. So there's two of them that are together because things have happened, and they have to know how to deal with emergencies.
Excellent question. Thank you for those answers. Ella is curious on how long it takes for astronauts to recover when they come back to Earth.
Very good question. So it varies on the individual, of course, but generally they do about 6 months. Just like if they're in space for 6 months, they do about 6 months of recovery work. But usually, again, it depends. I was just listening. There was a podcast I was listening to like 2 days ago, and it was with Christina Cook. And she was talking about when she came back to Earth. She said, it only took her a couple of hours to actually walk again. That didn't seem that bothersome, but it really was a couple of weeks before she got her balance right. So the brain has to get retrained to learn about getting the signals that we get, that we sort of take for granted here on Earth. And so this helped her to, she had to retrain that. And of course, she came back also when COVID was happening. And so just, socialization, re-socialization, that took some time because she was used to being just with a few select people up on the International Space Station. So it's interesting to see what they say about that.
Yeah, Marcy nailed it. I've got nothing extra to add.
Well, excellent. Thank you. We have another question about, why do they take food to space?
Well, it's important to eat, right? Very important. But actually, so it's something that they're working on in terms of if they go to Mars, going to the moon, and staying there for longer time periods. And they can't rely on resupply ships to come and bring them food. So besides taking food with them, how will they have food? So they've been learning about plants in space and growing plants. And in fact, one of the things they did on a recent mission was grow hatch chili peppers. And so they had taco night up in space with these chili peppers. So they were all excited about having real peppers on tacos there in space. So they're learning. They've grown lettuce because normally they don't like have salads in space. And Jessica Meir said one of the things that she really likes are salads. And so when they actually grew the lettuce and could eat it, it was awesome to be able to do that. So yeah, food is really, really important. And also water, to have water. So one of the things, I didn't even talk about it, but one of the things they do with water is they recycle their water. So when they urinate, that water goes through a big filtration machine and it becomes their drinking water in a couple days. So they say yesterday's coffee is tomorrow's coffee. So that's how it works.
I know you can't see me on camera, but I'm making a face. But I understand the necessity for doing that. So thank you. Thank you, Marcy.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, just down the road from where I am in Guelph, where we had one of our attendees from, the university there is actually doing research on helping to grow plants in space as well. So I was chatting with a PhD candidate in that program, and he was telling me a little bit about the work he's doing. So they are definitely improving and getting more and more abilities to have that happening in space. So pretty exciting stuff.
Very exciting.
Yes, most definitely. Another question we have is, how long can someone stay in space?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So right now, Mark Vendehe, he's going to be coming down in a couple weeks, and he's going to mark 355 days in space on just one mission. So that's almost a year, 1 day shy of a year. And so we'll see how he does when he comes back. There has been a Russian cosmonaut who's been over 400 days in space during the Russian Space Station Mir program. And we don't really know. This is something that they're studying and they're learning about. And like I said, in terms of the different medical testing, they don't know. And again, to go to Mars is an extremely long mission. And really, in order to do it well, they're going to need to figure out better rocket propulsion so they can get there faster and come back faster. So we'll see what happens. It'll be interesting. And the young people out there in the audience, this is all this stuff's gonna be figured out in your lifetime. So stay tuned.
Yeah, I know some of the research that was coming out of Waterloo was finding that 6 months in space aged your heart anywhere between 10 and 20 years, just in terms of artery flexibility. So it will be interesting just to see that length of time, if that, grows faster or it's about the same, or maybe it slows down as your body adjusts. So lots more experiments to be had.
Absolutely.
So all of our younger viewers, or just naturally curious viewers, stay curious and keep asking these questions, because I guarantee you NASA is thinking about them too, and they're recruiting for the future, as well as the Canadian Space Agency, European Space Agency, and all of our other partners. So there was another question in the chat here. From Kim, that seems like women from various occupations can become an astronaut. How long is that process? And Dennis replied that most are in their 30s with doctoral degrees, or are military jet pilots, ideally test pilots with a master's degree in engineering or another STEM field. It takes about 2 years of training after you're selected as an astronaut candidate, and then you wait for a spaceflight assignment while they work on projects on the ground. So an excellent example is Jenny Sidey Gibbons, who she was selected, but she has not yet been assigned a space flight yet. But just to kind of give you an idea on some of the areas that the female astronauts study, Marcy, I know I'm putting you on the spot, and Jen, I'm putting you on the spot, but could either of you talk about, what Jenny Sidey Gibbons researches and just kind of what her background is?
Jen?
Sure. I was just racking my brain for reading that a couple weeks ago. But yeah, she was studying combustible in flames in space. Am I right, Marcy?
Yeah, I believe it was something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, she has her PhD in it, and she actually did her PhD in partnership with the Canadian Space Agency. So she was already it was either her master's or her PhD, but she was already kind of in conversation with them, working on stuff that they were very interested in, that she was obviously very interested in. So it seems like it was a good match, for sure.
And something else to consider, to apply as an astronaut, a lot of the astronauts don't get in on their first try. In fact, some of them have applied multiple times. I know one astronaut, it took him 13 tries to get in as an astronaut. Now you might think, wow, you give up after a certain number of times, but no, he was relentless. He kept going 13 times. Even Peggy Whitson, who was a biomedical engineer before she became an astronaut, and she had worked for NASA in this area beforehand. It took her a couple tries to become an astronaut. So basically pick out some science you're interested in, or medicine, or aviation, aerospace, engineering. They take anybody in a STEM field who's really devoted to it. And you just need to hone in on what it is that really interests you, because you may not be able to make it as an astronaut. So you better like what you're studying, because you might be with that instead, is the story.
It's true.
Yeah, so all excellent questions, all excellent questions. And I guess something else to think about too, we've talked a lot about Canadian Space Agency astronauts and NASA astronauts, but we're in this interesting phase in space history too, with commercial crews as well. So stay tuned for more on that as that field continues to grow too, because we have Dr. Cyan Proctor, who is a geologist, right, Marcy?
She's a not coming to my brain. Something geology, yeah. I don't think a geologist, but something geo.
Yeah, so like what Jen and Marcy were saying, find your passion and explore and be curious, ask lots and lots of questions, because there's a place for you, whether it's as an astronaut, whether that's as an engineer, a data analyst, anything like that. You don't have to just be a test pilot or an engineer to have a place in NASA, in the Canadian Space Agency, and others. So if you have any other questions, now's the time, or forever hold your peace. Please throw them into the chat box. And if there are no others, we will say thank you again for joining us this evening, and be on the lookout for the recording to be put on YouTube and our upcoming programs at both the City of Waterloo Museum. If you're in Canada, if you're in Ontario, Waterloo, check it out. I want to travel to go see it myself.
Me too.
Come down to the International Women's Air and Space Museum as well. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night. Bye.